I was asked to talk about the notion of citizenship in early Islam and pre-modern period, and so I'll begin with some general remarks and not really go much beyond that. So let me begin, in fact, with the Marrakesh Declaration that Dr. Sinanovic just mentioned. And he said there was nothing new in content, but that the signatories are traditional scholars. And that was new, that they're buying into sort of, what seems to have been the reformist agenda for some time, that the traditional strictures on the membership, equal membership of non-Muslims should be upheld, and that they are somehow abandoning that. I would argue that in fact there is nothing new, not even in that element. In fact, the the folks who wear the traditional cloak have been accepting the if you will, the policies dictated by the strongmen in the Middle East, in the Arab, particularly the Arab states, since the beginning of these states in mid-20th century. And if you look at the scholars who claim that tradition, mostly pro-establishment scholars who have agreed that yes, we are willing to accord equal citizenship and so on, but none of that in fact offers an actual interesting argument engaged with their tradition. So I would say that it is what has been happening in the 20th century in the Muslim states is a more interesting story can be told based on intellectual, political, and global trends. In other words, Muslim elite, Muslim strongmen, autocrats, dictators have adjusted to their mechanisms, if you will, of staying in power to different circumstances in which a certain contingent of scholars have always served as yes men. And so that's not incredibly new. Because when we talk about Marrakesh Declaration, it talks about citizenship of non-Muslims, but we don't really hear much about citizenship per se. We don't really hear about citizenship of Muslims or non-Muslims. We don't really have any rights that belong to people who live there. There is no strong pushback against the current status quo. So it seems to me to be a document that compiled in order to serve agendas other than advancing serious traditional discourse. Let me then move back and look at the challenge of what is citizenship, how to map this new concept of citizenship that emerges in 17th and 18th century Europe in the absolutist state of its major, or one famous theorist is Thomas Hobbes, who argues in the wake of a English Civil War and a receding church that individuals should give up some of their liberty in order to give the certain authorities to the Leviathan, the state, and from that argument emerges a discourse on the rights of citizens, especially that becomes stronger in John Locke, who writes later in the 17th century, in the 18th century. In the 19th century, when we see the birth of the nation state, these rights become more front and center. So that's the story of citizenship as we see it in the West. We often don't question where this citizenship comes from, why talk about citizenship in terms of rights, and what, if anything, has gone awry with the notion of citizenship as we imagine it today. In other words, one interesting critique, for example, of this notion of citizenship has been that citizenship is a set of rights given to those who belong in a certain place, and it is based on the notion of exclusions and inclusions. Certain rights are given to people who belong, and others who don't have rights, they don't belong. What we don't talk about, we don't talk enough about, is the question of investment in a society and acts of citizenship. Professor, I'm going to butcher his name because I don't quite know, Anjum who has written this amazing book on questioning this story called Acts of Citizenship, where he emphasizes that citizenship should be invested in, we should reconceptualize citizenship as something that is, that hinges more on the investment that individuals make in a community, and that sort of, that reciprocity. And if you imagine citizenship not as the rights of territorial belonging, but in a broader sense, then he argues that one can begin to see much more possibility of thinking of citizenship in pre-modern Islamic systems. And he points out one important institution, the institution of waqf, which both Muslims and non-Muslims could invest in, and waqfs, or endowments, could allow members of these communities to have a long-term relationship and investment in the communities to which they belong. And in that sense, the sense of belonging that Christians had to a city of, for example, Damascus or Cairo, was no less than the sense of belonging that Muslims had. And these were institutional and legally protected mechanisms by which these citizens, or citizens, quote unquote, could feel that they're just as invested in things going right, rather than thinking of it in terms of certain legal possessions that they have, that is rights. Scholars of waqf point out, for example, that a Christian's rights in Islamic jurisprudence, once looks through these manuals, they don't talk about, they don't have a chapter of citizenship, they have a chapter on waqf. But the rights of Christians and Christian endowments are protected just as much as Muslim endowments, and in that sense there is no difference. There is a legal order that is upheld. In fact, there are juristic discussions about whether if a Christian leaves his estate to a mosque, would that be acceptable or not? And the concern there is that a Christian should naturally not leave his estate to a mosque, but to a Christian cause. And if a Christian may be doing so, it's likelihood that there was some coercion or something involved, and there is greater need for oversight, meaning that Christians should do things that Christians normally do, and that right should be protected by Islamic law and Muslim qadis and jurists. So that's sort of citizenship understood in slightly a different way than we normally think of as rights, the kind of citizenship that is bequeathed to us by the tradition of Hobbes to Locke, and then the nation state. Now let me take a different tack on the kind of problem that citizenship in Islam presents. Now the traditional story is that Muslims are emerge in Arabia as a super tribe. That is, the Islamic community is sees itself as a community of guidance. The Quran establishes the mission of this community, and that mission is that kuntum khayra ummatin, you are the best of communities, raised for mankind, brought forth for mankind, meaning you are a missionary community. It would make sense if any law that comes out of that commandment privileges those who believe in that mission, take part of that mission, and those who reject it are treated differently. Once Islamic legal order gets established, one finds something very interesting, which is the Quranic, what we may call Quranic realism, which is that on the one hand, the Quran claims a claim to absolute truth, that this is the right guidance. On the other hand, the Quran says something very strange and very odd that seems almost out of character for a claim, for a text, a scripture that is so absolutely self-assured, which is that La ikraha fi din, there is no coercion in religion. That is, if the Quran knows and is so adamant that Muslims, all believers, must know, must believe that heaven and hell, their eternal success depends on believing in this message, then why give any quarter to those who don't believe? Yet you find in the legal order of Islam a different ethos than what you would find, if you will, in the theological ethos. The theology is there is one absolute truth, and people believe and people don't believe. I mean, you can talk about pluralistic theologies, but that's, on the whole, that's a relatively recent development. Supersessionism seems to be the dominant ethos in the Quran, but the legal order seems to give quarter, seems to say, well, it's kind of like an example would be, you have sort of imagine a kindergarten where in a building that is on fire. You go there and you tell the children, hey, there's a building is on fire, and everybody and the children don't pay attention. What is your ethical responsibility then? If you proceed just from the theological imperative, you must force them to convert, because they're otherwise going to hell. But the legal command, starting with the commandments in the Quran and many others, is that you let them be. So that's the first interesting point I want to make, that I think that a distinction that we often don't make between the Quranic theological order and the legal order. And that the legal order proceeds in a slightly different direction, in tension, if you will, or logical tension with the Quranic theological order. Now, if you go with this, the theological narrative, which I think certainly remains sort of overshadows and guides the theological order, which is that this community that has the truth that guides people to God, and it has its laws. What role do others have in it? You find that the laws of dhimma, or protection of non-Muslim peoples, we shouldn't call them minorities, by the way. Dhimmis were not minority for a very long time, but rather non-Muslim peoples under Muslim rule, and they were given certain rights. The question here is, of course, in a sense, because they don't belong, in a sense, to the theological mission, should they have legal rights or not? And because my time is running out, I'll simply end with this general direction, which is that even though that theological order remains, I think, in effect, but Islamic legal order allows, starting with very Quranic foundations and not simply later historical contingencies, one finds that there's Quranic imperatives to make exceptions to what would seem to be a theological imperative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anjum.